Sextus Julius Caesar, governor of Syria, 47 to 46 BCE. One of the two known second cousins of Gaius Julius Caesar, Sextus Julius Caesar's entire career was spent in the service of his most renowned relative. A young man just reaching office-holding age when the civil war broke out between Caesar and Pompey, Sextus served at the dictator's side and seemed to acquit himself well enough. After Pharsalus and the Alexandria expedition, Sextus accompanied his cousin to Syria and Asia Minor for his famous lightning campaign. For the first time, the conqueror of Gaul decided to give his young relative an independent command as governor of Syria. In addition to keeping the peace, it is likely that Sextus was expected to lay some of the groundwork for the much-anticipated Parthian expedition. Given his kinship and loyalty to Caesar, Sextus Caesar was destined for greatness, especially when one considers the dictator's lack of a direct male heir and his increasing years. However, it was not to be. One of Sextus's subordinates, a pardoned Pompeian, led a mutiny which resulted in the death of the young governor. The mutineers would ensure that parts of Syria remained embroiled in war even after Caesar's victory at Munda in 45. In fact, Caesar's men were still trying to avenge Sextus when the dictator was assassinated, and this led to the eventual surrender and absorption of all of the legions in Syria into the army of Gaius Cassius Longinus, the most important of Caesar's assassins. Sextus was a minor figure, due only to his early death. Despite his lack of name recognition, both the potential and actual consequences of his death were greater than most of the Roman commanders of this era. As a patrician gens, the Julii stretched back to the dawn of the Republic. That being said, for much of the Republic's history, the Julii had not been all that prominent. However, starting in the late Republic, they had risen back to prominence, and there were now three branches of the family that were powerful enough to contend for the consulship. One of those three branches was the Sextus Julius Caesar branch. We talked about the Lucius Julius Caesar branch not long ago, and of course there is the Gaius Julius Caesar branch. In the Sextus branch, the grandfather of the person we're going to talk about today, Sextus Julius Caesar, served as consul in 91 before he died due to the social war in 89. The next, Sextus Julius Caesar, is not well attested because his service was entirely religious. He was the Flamen Curinalis during the early 50s. And the reason why he is not well attested is simply because the duties of the Flamen Curinalis, the chief priest of Quirinus, which is usually believed to be the sort of archaic name for the deified Romulus, is that the Flamen Curinalis is not allowed to do a number of things because of the need for ritual purity, and the things that he's prohibited from doing would really not be compatible with an active or successful senatorial career. For instance, the chief priest cannot touch metal, ride a horse, or spend the night outside of Rome. So you can see how serving as any kind of Roman magistrate would be more or less out of the question. So Sextus Julius Caesar of the middle generation was largely outside of politics. But when it came to the third generation, Appian tells us that Sextus was very young in 47, and that means that he was just coming into office-holding age or was perhaps a little bit shy of it. In general, a lot of times in antiquity, you would not be considered a full-grown man until about the age of 30, in terms of when people would start taking you seriously and when you would be held accountable for your actions. So it's not uncommon to refer to someone, even though they're a full-grown man well into their 20s, as being very young. So he could be under 30, he probably was even under 25. We don't really know. And because of the Civil War going on, once he starts to enter into his career, the minimum ages for offices are not going to be observed very closely, especially since Sextus sides with his cousin, his second cousin that is, Gaius Julius Caesar. And not only does he side with him, but serves him with a great deal of vigor. And so he earns Caesar's trust, and Caesar was eager to reward him and utilize him. So far as we can tell, Sextus would begin his career at Caesar's side in 49 and would be beside him all the way through to 47. He would be something like a staff officer during that time. The Alexandrian War further comments that Caesar considered Sextus to be not only a relative but also a friend, so the two became close as they campaigned alongside of each other for about 2 years. In the 1950s and 60s, the British scholar Brofton produced a 3-volume work called Magistrates of the Roman Republic, where he went through and tried to chronicle the careers of every known magistrate during the entirety of the Roman Republic. And by the way, that kind of a massive scale reference work was something that was much more common in terms of what scholars would work on between about 1850 and 1950. Partly because of how well those scholars did their job, and partly because of changes in what makes an academic successful. Those kind of works really don't get made anymore. At any rate, in this work, Brofton wanted to look at many people from the late Republic, including Sextus Julius Caesar, and he did some guesswork about what official ranks and titles Sextus might have held throughout his career. This is to say that we don't have any firm attestation of a lot of offices that he may or may not have held. Brofton believes, reasonably enough, that Sextus was named as a military tribune in 49, so that would go along with him being something of a staff officer in Italy and then in Spain. And then he might have been formally appointed to the quaestorship in 48, which would keep him in a similar role, but give him a little bit more power and flexibility. So he'd also be responsible now for handling supplies, money, and things like that. We know he was with Caesar in 48 and 47 as well, and when he was appointed governor of Syria, we don't really know what rank he was given at the time, but Brofton says that he could have been either pro-quaestor, or he might have been elevated to pro-praetor, which is perhaps a little bit more likely given the importance of Syria and the fact that the province had been threatened as recently as 53 in the aftermath of Crassus's catastrophe at Carrhae. We don't really know what rank he held, which is why in the title I called him the governor of Syria rather than putting him down as a pro-quaestor or pro-praetor. But one of the reasons why I went into this is to show that I'm not the only person apparently who is interested in doing guesswork to try to reconstruct the early parts of people's careers. I'm just one of the few people still alive who does stuff like that. After he overran Italy in 49, Caesar famously elected to go after the army without a general rather than the general without an army. That is to say, he decided to let Pompeian Greece be while he went after Pompey's standing legions in Spain that were under his lieutenants Petronius and Afranius. Caesar was able to win this campaign relatively quickly when the two generals offered him battle, and he had defeated, I think, 4 of the 6 legions that were present in Spain. The other 2 legions were under a commander named Marcus Terentius Varro, and while Varro was determined to try to fight and to try to keep the battle going, he was deeper into Spain, so it would have taken some time for Caesar to reach him and force things to a conclusion. Varro's men were having none of it. They made it very clear to him that they would not fight Caesar. 1 legion, in fact, walked out of camp, and when Varro with his remaining legion approached the city of Italica, it shut its gates to him and told him that he should surrender. So both the residents of one of the major Roman cities and one of his 2 legions made it clear that they preferred Caesar, whether it was because they were loyal to Caesar, as Caesar would have us believe, or whether they simply didn't want any of his army that had been in Gaul that was basically unbeatable. We don't really know. Varro, however, was not a man who was willing to become a martyr at that time, so he accordingly decided to write to Caesar and offer to surrender in order to save his own life and prevent a campaign that would end in a bloody and pointless failure. Sextus was entrusted with handling this surrender, so he rode into camp, met with Varro. He assumed command of the 2 legions, they accepted Sextus, and Varro handed over all of his account books and treasury, so effectively Sextus became the substitute for Varro until Caesar could make more permanent arrangements, which would ultimately involve the disastrous decision to leave Quintus Cassius Longinus in charge. and of course he would engage in wide-scale corruption and ultimately sow the seeds for a Pompeian comeback in Spain. We don't know if Sextus Julius Caesar was present at either Pharsalus or Caesar's campaign in Alexandria. Most likely he was present for at least one of the two. That being said, we know for a fact that he was present in Syria. Here, Caesar would land, and he was faced with a number of challenges to his authority. There were Pompeian forces trying to reorganize after Pharsalus, and they had had a bit of a breather because of Caesar's extended stay in Egypt. And there were also non-Romans who were threatening to upset Roman order in the region. This area, it's worth noting, was brought into the Roman Republic by Pompey about 20 years earlier, and so this was an area where Caesar had no real connections. That being said, in many ways this was Caesar's most impressive campaign. It lasted perhaps 30 days, if that, and Caesar would rapidly seek out and destroy a few different armies. At the end of the campaign he quipped, "I came, I saw, I conquered." He could have added, "and I left my cousin in charge afterwards," but that would have kind of messed up the pithiness of the quip. So we're pretty sure that Caesar left Sextus as governor, at least that's what the Alexandrian War, a continuation of Caesar's commentaries, says. However, the later Greek historian Appian contests that a bit, and really doesn't make it clear exactly what Sextus's legal status might have been. So what we're going to do is explore that issue and also what was expected of Sextus in this new independent command. We'll see that most likely the assignment that Sextus ended up getting ended up being more involved than what he or his patron most likely envisioned. The controversy over the precise nature of Sextus Caesar's governorship is because of a source disagreement between the commentaries on the Civil War, and this would be the Alexandrian War written by one of Caesar's continuators, in this case possibly Aulus Hirtius, and Appian, a later historian of Greek descent. It all centers around the role of a man named Quintus Caecilius Bassus. He is said to have been a Pompeian soldier and a prominent equestrian who fought at Pharsalus. After the battle, he fled to the city of Tyre, where presumably he had some sort of commercial interest, and here he seems to have received Caesar's pardon. Not only did Caesar pardon him, but apparently when Caesar was about to leave and leave his cousin in command, he decided to hire Bassus as an assistant to Sextus Caesar. That being said, in Appian's account, he presents Sextus as the commander of a single legion, whereas Bassus was the actual governor. Now, it's possible that Caesar decided to make Bassus a senator and to employ him as a governor in that way. Caesar could do something like that, and he made many men senators. That being said, it's also possible that he was simply there as an administrator without any official rank, or that when he was given senatorial rank, it was still below that of the real governor, Sextus Caesar. After all, why would Caesar leave a man that he barely knows and has no real reason to trust in charge when he has his cousin around, a man who is a thoroughgoing loyalist and someone who needs some seasoning and a chance at independent command for the battles to come? Appian gives us that as his main account, but he also gives us an alternative version that he read from another source. And he names the source, I believe the source is named Libo. But he says that in the alternative account, Bassus was a former soldier of Pompey who had then settled at Tyre and was in retirement, but decided, due to discontent with Sextus's leadership, to spark a mutiny among the legionaries, and when the mutiny resulted in Sextus's death, he then assumed command of the troops and the province. So there was a lot of controversy about exactly what happened, and even about the status and role of Caecilius Bassus. The most substantive difference between Appian's account and the earlier account of the pro-Caesarian Alexandrian War is that in the Alexandrian War, Sextus Caesar is largely the victim of a plot by Bassus, whereas in Appian's account, the fault really lay with Sextus himself for behaving arrogantly. Let's think back to what Sextus's mission was. According to Appian, the idea was for Sextus to keep a legion in Syria and perhaps do a bit of scouting, hold the frontier for a while, become accustomed with the land, and be something like the advance guard for when Caesar eventually returned with enough legions to mount a Parthian expedition. Caesar had dreamt of avenging Crassus since at least 53, and for many years before that he had wanted to emulate Alexander. His conquest of Gaul was great, but it didn't bring in quite as much wealth or glory as the conquest of the East might. As Caesar was getting older, he was in a hurry to avenge Crassus sooner rather than later. And that had actually been one of his major demands when he was negotiating with Pompey. One of the reasons why he didn't want to undergo a trial and delay having another consulship is that he wanted to get to a proconsulship in Syria as quickly as possible so he could get on with the war. And perhaps he managed to impart this vision of a glorious Parthian war to his young protege. According to Appian's account, Sextus started to get a big head. And he also started to go native, I guess you could say, because he started to take on local customs. Now, if he merely was speaking Greek in a Greek-speaking area, that would be par for the course for a Roman noble. Pretty much every Roman noble by this period was quite fluent in Greek, and they simply used their Greek when they were in the East rather than making the locals learn Latin. That being said, we don't know exactly what going native might entail. It could be anything from taking on local dress to trying out local foods to anything like that. And those things would not be all that unusual, so most likely this is a bit of an excuse after the fact. Now, one thing that might be more substantive is that Sextus may have begun to act more imperious because he started to think of himself as something like the heir apparent. And so he might have begun to issue orders that were a bit beyond his station as a mere quaestor or perhaps acting praetor. And among the people who received abuse from him were his troops and Bassus. Appian's account presents things really spiraling out of control after Sextus had been pushing his troops a little harder than he should have, and then he summoned Bassus to face his wrath after Bassus had messed up in some way or other. Perhaps he wasn't satisfied with Bassus's efficiency as a manager of resources or something like that. And so he brought Bassus to account for himself. When it comes to precisely how things went off the rails and Sextus ended up dying, there are more inconsistencies between the Alexandrian War and Appian. It's worth mentioning, first of all, that in the Alexandrian War, Sextus's conduct is never brought into question, and the entire affair is blamed on Bassus taking advantage of rumors from Africa that Caesar had been killed in action at Thapsus and that his cause was falling apart. And as we mentioned, there was some truth in those rumors insofar as Petrus and Labienus had won a number of skirmishes. Now, in the Alexandrian War, the claim is effectively that Bassus must have had a body of men under his command, and that he arrived at Sextus' camp trying to win over the remainder of the men, and that resulted in a skirmish between the two forces, which Sextus won. However, after Sextus won that initial encounter, the men under his command decided to go over to Bassus, and so they betrayed him and murdered him, and then Bassus became the overall commander. Appian's account perhaps makes a bit more sense in terms of exactly how things played out once Bassus and Sextus came into contact. And in this account, Appian has Sextus arrest Bassus, and this is compatible with the idea in Appian that Sextus was in direct control of the men, and that Sextus overreached when he brought Bassus before him, that he put on an absurd spectacle, and that because his men were already tired of his antics, they decided to put him to death and make Bassus their leader. But in the end, the results were the same. Bassus claimed the office of governor, and he also claimed the rank of praetor, which, of course, in turn makes it more likely that Caesar had elevated his cousin to praetor in order to be governor of Syria. But in the end, we had a revolt against Caesarian authority based on a false rumor and a self-appointed governor. So this was effectively a second coming of Odius Varus in the form of the, up to this point, unknown Caecilius Bassus. We don't know exactly when Caesar learned of his cousin's death and the loss of Syria, but perhaps it was not long before or after he learned about his cousin Lucius's death. When it came to the death of Lucius the Younger, as we've seen, Caesar really didn't care. He thought that Lucius was a complete loser. But he was quite fond of Sextus, and he also was intent upon holding Syria, so he was furious when he learned about the betrayal of his beloved cousin, and he ordered counterattacks from his generals in Cilicia. Bassus, for his part, along with his men, knew that Caesar's usual mercy would not apply to them. After all, they had taken out someone who, in theory, could one day have been Caesar's heir. So they were more determined than ever to fight to the death. And for Bassus in particular, he had already accepted Caesar's pardon once. That may well have been true for many of the men as well. Bassus went about raising an additional legion and had it in the field before the 4 or so legions from Cilicia arrived. Bassus holed up at the major city of Apamea, which was a major center dating back to the Seleucid period, and he was still holding out here with his 2 legions when Caesar was assassinated. He was rescued from starvation by Gaius Cassius Longinus, who, of course, participated in Caesar's murder and was then pardoned, and used his pardon and his special command in the east to end the war between Caesar's lieutenants and Bassus. Cassius, of course, then took all the legions involved in that conflict and brought them, most likely, to the Battle of Philippi, where they were defeated. As for Bassus personally, he's never mentioned again in our sources, most likely because of how hierarchical the army of the Avengers was, and how rigid it was about social rank and things like that. Bassus, as a self-appointed praetor, was not taken seriously, despite his services to the cause, and he may very well have died at Philippi or simply gone home after being relieved at Apamea. Due to his early death, Sextus Julius Caesar never came close to realizing his potential. And make no mistake about it, his potential was almost unlimited. He seems to have had some ability and energy. He was also the best positioned of Caesar's younger male relatives to serve as heir apparent. Caesar clearly liked him and trusted him. And it's obvious from the way that he was utilized that Caesar had pretty big plans for him. He was just about as related to Caesar as Octavian or Lucius the Younger, and when compared with them, he was a little older, more experienced, and in better health than Octavian, and when compared to Lucius the Younger, he had been loyal during the Civil War, and no one described him as a broom untied. So Sextus, by all accounts, was the obvious go-to pick. And of course, this is assuming that Appian's account about his behavior is exaggerated or even made up. But even if he were an arrogant young man, that is not all that uncommon in young men who are about to inherit power. That being said, that account of his supposed arrogance in Syria is loaded to the gills with tropes. Going native in the east, behaving arrogantly toward his soldiers, and all those things kind of just seem like stock complaints that one would make to justify murdering someone. Make no mistake about it, if he had managed to stay alive until the Ides of March, Sextus would have been a major factor following Caesar's assassination. Perhaps the conspirators would have had to include Sextus and Antony and a few others in their plans rather than letting them go. So let's say that they went ahead with the plan to just kill Caesar and Sextus was still on the scene, whether he's in Syria or whether he's in Rome at the time. My suspicion is that he might have been the named heir rather than Octavian, if for no other reason than that Octavian at that time seemed rather sickly and unlikely to have a long life. Sextus, as someone who was probably pushing 30 at that time, clearly enjoyed decent health and had shown enough experience and viability, and also would have been exposed to the troops at least a little bit, so he would have had a bit more cachet. At the same time, he still would have been fresh because he wouldn't have had any major commands. If he had been in the East, then he at the very least could have rallied troops there and prevented Cassius from consolidating the East and giving himself and Brutus a pretty much a puncher's chance at Philippi. Philippi was a very closely contested battle, and if Cassius had not been able to get all the forces of the East together, then the Caesarians would have had an insuperable advantage from the beginning. Another factor that would work in Sextus's advantage if he had tried to be Caesar's heir after the Ides of March is that as the son of the Flamen Quirinalis, he was someone who had a clear track record of being related to very high-ranking priest. So one of the problems Octavian had is that the title of Pontifex Maximus went to Lepidus, and that made Lepidus more or less physically untouchable until his death in early 12 BCE. Octavian was literally chomping at the bit and engaged in some major pettiness that showed just how exasperated he was that Lepidus wouldn't kick the bucket and put the title up for grabs. Sextus might have had an actual chance, despite his youth, of becoming Pontifex Maximus and really consolidating Caesar's package of powers early. And a lot of that is due to being a little older and having a father who was a major part of Rome's religious establishment for years. And also, I don't know for sure, but it's even possible that the elder Sextus was still alive at this time. The only time I've ever heard him mentioned was in the early 50s, but there is no given date of death for him, so he may very well have still been around. At any rate, I just find it interesting, and I sort of feel like Sextus Julius Caesar the Younger is kind of like the Franz Ferdinand of the late Roman Republic. He was someone who was in a pretty good position to become heir, and his premature death very much changed everything, especially for Octavian. And that's why I believe that Sextus appears so infrequently in our sources. Octavian, as the person who eventually did succeed Caesar, didn't want anyone to remember that there was a time when he was not destined to be Caesar's heir. He wanted people to think that the gods perhaps had ordained it, that Caesar would never have a son, and that his daughter would die young before she could give him a grandson, and that it had to pass to the grandnephew. He didn't want people to think about the cousins of Caesar who could have potentially inherited. And so, in my opinion, that is partly why Appian's account of Sextus Julius Caesar is so negative and dismissive. Anyhow, that's all I have for you now. I thought this was one of the more compelling what-ifs. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and when we next pick up, we'll be doing a bit of a detour back into the 80s, and then doing a bit of a flash forward before we get back on track to go to Gaius Scribonius Curio and Lepidus the Triumvir. So take care, and I will see you very soon.